December 15th, 1944. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German staff officers huddled over maps in bunkers lit by kerosene lamps. Field telephones connected them to forward units through cables buried beneath snow and mud. Landlines stretched back through Luxembourg and into the Siegfried Line, carrying orders in Morse code and scratchy voice circuits. This was how armies communicated. Wires, physical connections, tangible links that could be cut but, when intact, offered security and certainty. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The officers believed they understood their enemy. They had studied American doctrine, intercepted American radio traffic, analyzed American tactics. The Americans were wealthy, yes. Their factories could produce tanks and aircraft in staggering numbers, but coordinating vast armies, managing the intricate ballet of corps, divisions, and support units across hundreds of miles of front, that required something beyond industrial might. It required the kind of disciplined staff work that only German military tradition could provide. What these officers could not see, could not hear, could not imagine, was the invisible web that already surrounded them. High above the Ardennes, in the ether between frequencies, American radio signals pulsed and danced. Not the crude broadcasts they expected, but a sophisticated network of interlocking communications that coordinated not two, not three, but multiple field armies simultaneously. A nervous system of electromagnetic waves that could redirect divisions, resupply corps, and reconfigure entire army groups faster than any messenger or landline system ever conceived. The morning of December 16th would prove what German generals had long refused to believe, that America had built something revolutionary, something that rendered their carefully planned offensive obsolete before the first shell was fired. The question was not whether the German attack would surprise the Americans. It would. The question was whether surprise would matter when the Americans could respond with a speed and coordination that defied every assumption about the limits of military command. By late 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Allied armies, having broken out from Normandy in August, had raced across France and Belgium with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Paris had been liberated. The German border had been reached. Victory appeared inevitable, merely a matter of time. But appearances deceived. The rapid advance had stretched Allied supply lines to their breaking point. Fuel shortages forced entire divisions to halt. Ammunition stocks dwindled. The port of Antwerp, though captured in September, would not open until late November, and even then the flow of supplies could barely keep pace with the army's appetites. The Germans, meanwhile, had shortened their lines, falling back to positions closer to their industrial heartland and the intricate network of railways and roads that fed their forces. For the German High Command, this moment represented both crisis and opportunity. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. Soviet armies were advancing toward the Reich itself. In the West, overwhelming American and British forces pressed against the German border. Hitler's empire was collapsing, squeezed between two massive vises. Yet the Führer saw one last chance, one desperate gamble that might split the Allied coalition and force a negotiated peace. The plan was audacious. 30 divisions, including elite SS Panzer units, would strike through the Ardennes forest, exactly where the Germans had broken through in 1940. They would drive to Antwerp, cutting the Allied armies in two, surrounding and destroying 4 entire army groups. The offensive would exploit what German intelligence believed to be a fundamental weakness in the American command structure: the fault line between British and American forces, the supposed inability of the Allies to coordinate rapid responses across such vast distances. German planners understood their own system well. They had perfected the art of centralized command during the interwar years. Orders flowed from the top down through a rigid hierarchy. Staff officers calculated logistics with Prussian precision. Field armies moved according to carefully synchronized timetables. This system had carried them to the gates of Moscow and the shores of the Mediterranean. When it worked, it was devastatingly effective. But it relied on something fundamental: physical communication lines. The telephone and telegraph networks that connected headquarters to corps, corps to divisions, divisions to regiments. These landlines offered security that radio could never provide. The enemy could not intercept a wire buried 2 feet underground. Code breakers were useless against Morse signals tapped directly into copper cables. For the Ardennes offensive, the Germans took extraordinary precautions. All radio transmissions were forbidden. Orders travelled by motorcycle messenger or through field telephone networks. Movement occurred at night. Secrecy was absolute. What the Germans failed to grasp was that their enemy had evolved beyond such limitations. The United States Army of 1944 bore little resemblance to the inexperienced force that had stumbled through North Africa 2 years earlier. It had learned, adapted, innovated, and nowhere was this transformation more profound than in the realm of military communications. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had grown from a modest organization of 27,000 personnel in 1941 to a massive force exceeding 350,000 men and women by late 1944. This expansion was not merely quantitative. It represented a fundamental reimagining of what military communications could achieve. The Signal Corps had become, in effect, the nervous system of American military power. Without it, the armies could not function. With it, they could perform feats of coordination that seemed impossible. The technology was revolutionary. The SCR-2 99 mobile radio station, mounted in a truck, could transmit over distances exceeding 2,000 miles under optimal conditions. The SCR-300 backpack FM radio gave infantry squads reliable, static-free communication for the first time in military history. Radio relay systems, still experimental in 1943, now connected Army headquarters to Corps headquarters to divisional headquarters in cascading networks that could reroute traffic if any single node failed. But technology alone did not explain what the Americans had achieved. The real innovation was organizational. The Signal Corps had developed procedures for managing radio traffic on a scale never before attempted. Message centers could handle thousands of transmissions per hour. Frequency allocation charts prevented interference between adjacent units. Codes and ciphers, constantly updated, kept communications secure even when broadcast openly through the air. Most critically, the Americans had learned to coordinate operations across vast distances without requiring every decision to flow through a single central authority. This was the invisible revolution that German intelligence failed to perceive. They saw American radio traffic and dismissed it as crude, vulnerable to interception, lacking the security of their own landline networks. They observed American divisions operating with seeming independence and interpreted this as lack of coordination rather than its opposite. They noted that American doctrine emphasized flexible response and decentralized command, never realizing that such flexibility depended on a communications infrastructure more sophisticated than their own rigid, centralized system. By December of 1944, the Americans had 5 full-field armies operating in the European theater. The First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, held positions along the German border from the Ardennes north to Aachen. The Third Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George Patton, stretched south from the First Army to the Moselle River. The Seventh Army, part of the Sixth Army Group, advanced through Alsace. The Ninth Army prepared for operations across the Ruhr River, and the 15th Army, newly activated, handled occupation duties and provided strategic reserve. 5 armies, 15 corps, approximately 48 divisions, over 1.3 million men, all operating under a unified command structure that coordinated their movements through a web of radio transmissions, telephone circuits, and teletype networks. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHARF, sat at the apex of this pyramid under General Dwight Eisenhower. Below SHARF were army groups. The 12th Army Group, commanded by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, controlled the 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. The 6th Army Group, under Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, controlled the 7th. Each level of command maintained its own signal battalion. Signal companies attached to divisions, regiments, even battalions, thousands of radio operators, telephone switchboard operators, message center clerks, and line repair crews working around the clock to maintain the web of communications that made modern war possible. And increasingly, this web operated wirelessly. Radio transmissions that could not be cut, signals that could route around damage, networks that could reorganize themselves in minutes rather than hours. The Germans had studied this system. Their radio intelligence units monitored American frequencies constantly. They tracked the movement of divisions by analyzing call signs and message patterns. They exploited American operational security mistakes, and there were many. American units often transmitted in the clear, broadcasting map coordinates and unit designations that German listeners eagerly recorded. German analysts produced detailed assessments of American order of battle, identifying divisions and tracking their movements with impressive accuracy. But knowing where American units were located was not the same as understanding what they could do. German intelligence saw trees but missed the forest. They counted divisions without comprehending that those divisions could be coordinated with unprecedented speed and flexibility. They intercepted radio traffic without grasping that the sheer volume of such traffic represented not weakness but strength. They observed American reliance on radio and never imagined that this reliance had been transformed into a revolutionary system of command and control. This blindness was not unique to intelligence analysts. It infected the highest levels of German military command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Oberbefehlshaber West, the supreme commander in the West, planned the Ardennes offensive on assumptions that were already obsolete. He expected that splitting the Allied front would paralyze American decision-making, that cutting communications between army groups would leave individual armies floundering in isolation, that the Americans, lacking the German gift for improvised coordination, would take days or even weeks to mount an effective response. Every one of these assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong, not because of American tactical brilliance, though that would emerge as the battle progressed, but because the Germans had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the enemy they faced. They had prepared to fight an army organized according to their own principles, an enemy that thought as they thought, commanded as they commanded. Instead, they were about to collide with something entirely new, an army that could scatter its forces across hundreds of miles and yet remain more coordinated, more responsive, more dangerous than any force in history. The invisible web was already there, humming with traffic, ready to respond. The German offensive would achieve complete tactical surprise, but strategic surprise, that was impossible against an enemy that could see the entire battlefield, coordinate the movements of multiple armies, and respond with a speed that rendered even the most brilliant initial thrust ultimately futile. The stage was set. The German offensive would begin at 05:30 on December 16, 1944. Artillery would thunder, tanks would surge forward, infantry would advance through snow and fog, and in bunkers and command posts across Belgium, Luxembourg and France, American radio operators would spring into action, their fingers flying across telegraph keys, their voices calm on radio handsets, binding together an unprecedented response that would be measured not in days but in hours. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first artillery shells began falling at 05:30 on the morning of December 16th. American soldiers in forward positions heard the distant rumble before they saw anything. Then the horizon erupted in flashes of orange and red. Hundreds of German guns, carefully positioned during the night, opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The bombardment was devastating in its intensity, shattering the pre-dawn silence of the Ardennes forest with thunder that could be heard miles away. In bunkers and farmhouses transformed into outposts, American infantrymen scrambled for cover. Many units were green, inexperienced replacements sent to this quiet sector to gain confidence before being thrown into major battles elsewhere. Others were veterans, pulled back for rest after months of brutal fighting in the Ardennes forest and along the Siegfried Line. None expected what was about to hit them. As the artillery lifted, the German infantry advanced. Elite Volksgrenadier divisions surged forward through the snow, supported by the heavy rumble of tanks. Panzer divisions followed, their commanders eager to exploit any breakthrough. Fog and low clouds blanketed the battlefield, grounding the American air forces and giving the Germans a precious window of opportunity. By mid-morning, the assault had achieved complete tactical surprise. American forward positions were overrun. Communications were cut. Entire battalions found themselves surrounded or forced into hasty retreats. At the divisional and corps headquarters further back, confusion reigned initially. Reports flooded in, many contradictory. German paratroopers were supposedly landing behind the lines. English-speaking German soldiers in American uniforms were creating chaos at crossroads. The size and scope of the attack remained unclear. Was this a local counterattack, a spoiling assault meant to disrupt American offensive plans, or something far more serious? But even as confusion rippled through forward units, something remarkable was already happening. Something the Germans had not anticipated and could not have predicted. The American communications network was springing into action with a speed and coordination that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. At 1st Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges received the first reports of the German offensive by 0800. Within minutes, his signal officers were routing urgent traffic to 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg City, where General Omar Bradley was stationed. Radio transmissions crackled through the air, teletype machines chattered, field telephones buzzed with activity. The initial message was simple but critical. "We are under Major. Attack. Strength unknown. Request immediate support." Bradley's response was instantaneous. By 0930, he had contacted Supreme Headquarters in Versailles. By 1000 hours, Eisenhower was fully briefed, and by noon, just 6.5 hours after the German attack began, American forces were already mobilizing a coordinated response that would involve not one, not two, but 4 separate field armies operating across a front stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. This was the moment when German assumptions began to crack. The offensive had been planned on the belief that splitting the Allied front would paralyze command, that the British 21st Army Group in the north and the American 12th Army Group in the centre operated as separate entities that could not quickly coordinate. That American decision-making was slow and ponderous, that redeploying divisions would take days, even weeks. Every assumption was wrong. The American communications network that morning functioned with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. Consider what was actually happening. In Spa, 1st Army headquarters maintained radio contact with 5 corps, the 5th, 7th, 8th, 18th Airborne, and elements of the 9th. Each corps headquarters, in turn, coordinated multiple divisions. Signal battalions attached to these divisions operated networks of SCR-2, 99 mobile radio stations, SCR-5, 10 backpack radios for infantry, and extensive field telephone networks that connected command posts to forward positions. When German attacks severed telephone lines, as they inevitably did in areas of heaviest fighting, the radios took over. FM frequencies remained clear and static-free. Message centers rerouted traffic through alternate channels. The network bent but did not break. Information flowed upward from battalions to regiments to divisions to corps to army headquarters. Orders flowed back down, often within minutes. At 12th Army Group headquarters, Bradley's signal officers maintained a communications hub that would have been unimaginable to military planners just a decade earlier. Multiple teletype circuits connected Luxembourg City to Spa, to Versailles, to 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, to 9th Army headquarters near the Rue River. Radio networks provided backup for every telephone line. Cipher machines encrypted sensitive traffic. Message centers operated around the clock, handling thousands of transmissions every day. The first critical decision came within hours. Eisenhower, recognizing the severity of the German attack, ordered the immediate commitment of strategic reserves. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, refitting in France after the Market Garden operation, received movement orders by early afternoon on December 16th. These were not simple orders. They required coordinating transportation, ammunition supply, fuel allocation, and route assignments for 2 entire divisions, approximately 17,000 men, along roads that were already congested with retreating American units and advancing German spearheads. The logistics alone were staggering. The 101st Airborne was to move to Bastogne, a critical road junction in southern Belgium. The 82nd would move to Verbermont, further north. Both movements required dozens of truck convoys, careful traffic control, and constant updates on road conditions and enemy positions. The Signal Corps coordinated every aspect. Radio transmissions directed convoys around bottlenecks. Teletype messages updated fuel stops and supply points. Field telephones at crossroads kept military police informed of convoy movements. By December 18th, just 2 days after the German offensive began, American reinforcements were pouring into the Ardennes. The 101st Airborne reached Bastogne and immediately established a defensive perimeter. The 82nd took up positions that would anchor the northern shoulder of the German penetration. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army, positioned 60 miles south of the main attack, began one of the most remarkable redeployments in military history. Patton had been planning an offensive of his own, aimed at breaking through the Siegfried Line and driving into Germany. On December 19th, Bradley ordered him to disengage from this offensive, pivot 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. This meant moving 3 full divisions, approximately 60,000 men with all their equipment and supplies, across icy roads in the middle of winter, and launching a coordinated assault within 72 hours. Such a maneuver would have been considered impossible by traditional military standards. The Germans certainly thought it impossible. Moving an entire army required coordinating thousands of vehicles, rerouting supplies, establishing new command posts, laying new telephone lines, and briefing commanders on completely new objectives. The staff work alone should have taken weeks. Patton's army did it in 3 days. The key was communications. 3rd Army signal battalions had spent the fall building one of the most sophisticated radio networks in the European theatre. Patton was an early advocate of radio communications, recognizing that his preferred style of mobile warfare required flexibility that telephone lines could not provide. His signal officers had established redundant networks with backup frequencies, alternate routing, and procedures for rapid redeployment. When the order came to pivot north, these networks pivoted with him. Mobile radio stations loaded onto trucks and moved to new positions within hours. Radio relay stations established new links between Corps headquarters and the divisions that would lead the attack. Message centers adapted to handle the surge in traffic, as commanders issued thousands of orders coordinating the movement of tanks, artillery, infantry, and support units. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By December 22nd, Patton's forces were attacking north. The 4th Armoured Division drove toward Bastogne, now surrounded by German forces but still holding. The 26th Infantry Division attacked on Patton's left. The 80th Infantry Division advanced on his right. 3 divisions, 9 regiments, 27 battalions, all moving in coordination, all linked together by an invisible web of radio transmissions. And this was just one army. The First Army, though badly shaken by the initial German assault, was reforming along the northern shoulder of the penetration. The 9th Army sent reinforcements south. Even the 7th Army, operating in Alsace over 100 miles away, contributed forces to the general effort. 5 armies, coordinated through Shave, responding to a crisis with a speed that left German commanders stunned. At German headquarters, the realization was dawning that something had gone terribly wrong. The offensive had achieved tactical surprise, yes. Initial advances exceeded expectations, but the expected paralysis of American command never materialized. Instead, American forces seemed to be everywhere at once. Reinforcements appeared with impossible speed. Counterattacks developed within days rather than weeks. The Americans were reacting faster than German planning had anticipated. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, reported to Berlin that American communications appeared largely intact despite German breakthroughs. Radio intercept stations were picking up enormous volumes of American traffic. Far from being confused or disorganized, the American command structure seemed to be functioning at peak efficiency. German intelligence officers began reassessing their assumptions, but by then it was too late. The technical details of what the Americans had achieved were remarkable. At the peak of the Ardennes fighting, between December 16th and January 10th, American signal units in the European theatre handled an average of over 100,000 messages per day. This included encrypted radio transmissions, teletype traffic, telephone calls, and physical message dispatch. The volume exceeded anything attempted before in military history. The SCR-299 mobile radio stations proved their worth repeatedly. These truck-mounted units could maintain contact over hundreds of miles, providing backup communications when telephone lines were cut. Operators learned to exploit atmospheric conditions, bouncing signals off the ionosphere to reach distant headquarters. On clear nights, a single SCR-299 could coordinate multiple divisions across an area the size of a small European country. Infantry units relied on the SCR-300 backpack radio, which gave company and battalion commanders direct voice communication with their superiors. These FM sets, operating in the 40 to 48 MHz band, were largely immune to the jamming that plagued earlier AM systems. A battalion commander surrounded in Bastogne could radio for artillery support and receive it within minutes. Company commanders could coordinate with adjacent units without stringing telephone wire across fire-swept ground. The radio relay systems, still relatively new technology, proved invaluable for long-distance communications. These systems used multiple stations to receive and retransmit signals, extending effective range far beyond what a single radio could achieve. Army headquarters could maintain contact with Corps headquarters even when separated by mountains or long distances. The relay stations created redundancy that made the entire network more resilient. But the technology was only part of the story. The real innovation was procedural and organizational. American signal officers had developed standardized communications protocols that allowed different units to coordinate effortlessly. Message formats were consistent. Radio procedures were uniform. Code words and authentication systems prevented German deception. Frequency allocation charts kept adjacent units from interfering with each other. Most critically, the Americans had learned to operate a truly networked communications system. This was not a hierarchical structure where all information flowed through a single central headquarters. Instead, it was a web where multiple headquarters could communicate directly with each other, where information could flow horizontally as well as vertically, where local commanders could coordinate without waiting for higher authority to approve every decision. This flexibility confounded the Germans. When the German offensive split First Army from Third Army, severing the physical road connections between them, it barely mattered. Radio links remained intact. Bradley could coordinate both armies simultaneously, directing First Army's defense on the northern shoulder, while Patton attacked from the south. When Eisenhower temporarily transferred 1st Army and 9th Army to British 21st Army Group Command on December 20th to simplify coordination on the Northern Front, the signal networks adapted within hours. New circuits were established, new procedures implemented. The transition occurred almost seamlessly. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. They had planned this offensive for weeks, carefully calculating logistics, assembling forces, maintaining absolute secrecy. The attack had achieved complete surprise. Initial successes exceeded their most optimistic projections. Yet within days, it was clear the offensive was failing. Not because of superior American tactics or better equipment, but because the Americans could respond faster than the Germans could exploit success. German panzer commanders found themselves fighting battles of delay rather than exploitation. Instead of racing to Antwerp, they were fighting to hold villages. American reinforcements arrived faster than German intelligence predicted. Supply dumps that should have been captured remained in American hands. The critical road junctions that were supposed to fall quickly became fortresses that consumed days of precious time, and everywhere, always, there was the hum of American radio traffic. German signals intelligence units worked frantically to decrypt American codes, to track unit movements, to identify vulnerabilities. They had some success. American operational security was far from perfect, but even when they knew what the Americans were planning, they could not respond fast enough. The Americans moved too quickly, coordinated too well, adapted too seamlessly. By Christmas Day, just 9 days after the offensive began, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne on December 26th. The German advance had been halted along the entire front. The weather cleared, allowing American air forces to devastate German supply lines and tank columns. The offensive had created a bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name history would give to this battle, but it was a bulge that was rapidly being compressed from north and south as American forces counterattacked. The final German retreat began in mid-January of 1945. By January 25th, American forces had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, had failed completely. It had cost the Germans over 100,000 casualties, irreplaceable losses in men and equipment. More importantly, it had shattered any remaining illusions about German military capability. The Wehrmacht could no longer conduct major offensive operations. The war would end with Germany on the defensive, gradually ground down by overwhelming Allied superiority in men and materiel. But the real lesson of the Battle of the Bulge was not about firepower or manpower. It was about coordination. The Germans had achieved tactical surprise, concentrated overwhelming force at the point of attack, and exploited every advantage. Yet they had lost because their enemy possessed something they could not match, an ability to coordinate multiple armies across vast distances with unprecedented speed and efficiency, an invisible web of communications that turned scattered divisions into a unified force capable of responding to crises faster than the enemy could exploit them. For the American Signal Corps, the Battle of the Bulge represented vindication. Every innovation they had pioneered, every system they had developed, every procedure they had tested, proved itself under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The mobile radio stations, the FM backpack radios, the relay systems, the standardized protocols, the networked command structure, all worked exactly as designed. Better than designed, in fact. The system had demonstrated a resilience and flexibility that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The Germans, by contrast, faced the bitter recognition that their communications doctrine was obsolete. Their reliance on landlines had seemed prudent, secure, professional, yet it had proven brittle in the face of mobile warfare. When American forces cut German telephone lines, German units lost contact with higher headquarters. When American attacks isolated German divisions, those divisions could not coordinate their defenses. The very rigidity that German staff officers prized, the tight central control, the adherence to detailed plans, became liabilities when facing an enemy that could adapt faster than they could react. Captured German officers, interrogated after the battle, expressed confusion and frustration. They could not understand how the Americans had responded so quickly. How had Patton moved an entire army in 3 days? How had reserves appeared so rapidly? How did American commanders at all levels seem to know exactly where they were needed? The interrogators did not always tell them. Why educate the enemy about the full capabilities of American communications networks? But the answer was simple: radio, coordination, networks that could reconfigure themselves in real time. In the aftermath of the battle, as both sides counted their losses and prepared for the final campaigns of the war, the strategic implications became clear. Germany had lost its last chance to alter the outcome in the West. The road to the Rhine was now open. American and British forces would cross that river in March, driving deep into Germany. The Soviet armies would close from the east. By May, Germany would surrender unconditionally. But beyond the immediate strategic outcome, the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated something that would reshape military thinking for generations. That modern war was as much about information and communication as about firepower and maneuver. That the ability to coordinate forces rapidly across vast distances was now a decisive advantage. That technology, properly integrated into doctrine and organization, could multiply the effectiveness of military forces in ways that traditional thinking could not anticipate. The American achievement was not merely technical, it was conceptual. The Signal Corps had not simply deployed better radios. They had reimagined what military communications could accomplish. They had built a system where information flowed freely, where local commanders possessed the autonomy to make decisions, but remained integrated into a larger coordinated effort, where technology served as an enabler rather than a constraint. This was the invisible revolution that German generals had never imagined. They had seen American industrial might and understood it. They had faced American firepower and respected it. But they had completely missed the transformation in American command and control capabilities. They had planned to fight an army that thought and operated according to their own assumptions about how armies must function. Instead, they encountered an army that had evolved beyond those assumptions, that could do things they considered impossible. The legacy of this transformation would extend far beyond World War II. The principles developed by the American Signal Corps would become foundational to modern military communications. The emphasis on networked systems, on redundancy and flexibility, on standardized protocols that allowed diverse units to coordinate effortlessly, all of these became standard practice in subsequent decades. The Cold War military, with its sophisticated command and control systems, its satellite communications, its computer networks, all traced their conceptual lineage back to the innovations pioneered in the Signal Corps during World War II. For the soldiers who had lived through the battle, the memories remained vivid decades later. Radio operators recalled the intensity of those weeks, the endless shifts monitoring frequencies, the satisfaction of successfully routing critical messages through chaotic conditions. Officers remembered the speed with which their subordinates adapted, how seamlessly the communications networks functioned even under the most demanding circumstances. And commanders marveled at what had been achieved, that they had coordinated the movements of over 1 million men across hundreds of miles in the dead of winter, responding to a surprise attack with a speed that their enemy found incomprehensible. The Battle of the Bulge became a symbol of American resilience, of the ability to absorb terrible initial blows and yet respond effectively. But it was also a demonstration of something more subtle and more profound, that wars are won not just by courage and firepower, but by the invisible infrastructure that allows courage and firepower to be applied effectively. That communications, often overlooked in histories focused on combat, were in fact decisive in determining outcomes. German generals never imagined America's radio networks could coordinate 12 armies simultaneously. They never imagined because they could not conceive of military communications functioning that way. Their doctrine, their training, their entire conceptual framework for how armies operated was rooted in older paradigms. Physical communications, centralized control, rigid adherence to detailed plans. These had served them well for decades, but they were inadequate for the kind of war that was emerging by 1944. The Americans, by contrast, had embraced experimentation and adaptation. They had learned from failures in North Africa, refined their systems in Italy, and brought to Normandy and beyond a communications capability that was genuinely revolutionary. They had transformed radio from a supplement to wire communications into the primary means of command and control. They had built networks that could function at scales previously unimaginable, and they had integrated these capabilities so thoroughly into their doctrine and organization that they became natural, almost invisible, taken for granted by the soldiers who used them daily. This, ultimately, was the story that the Battle of the Bulge revealed. Not a story of heroic last stands or dramatic breakthroughs, though those occurred, but a story of infrastructure and capability, of systems working as designed under extreme stress, of an army that could coordinate itself with a speed and precision that rendered enemy planning obsolete before the first shot was fired. The invisible web had proven decisive, German generals had believed they understood their enemy. They had studied American doctrine, analyzed American capabilities, planned accordingly. But they had missed the most important transformation of all, that the Americans had built something that did not fit their categories of understanding, something that operated according to principles they had not anticipated, something that gave American forces a decisive advantage that no amount of tactical skill or operational planning could overcome. The war would continue for 4 more months. Berlin would fall to Soviet forces in May of 1945. Japan would surrender in August after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the fundamental lesson had already been demonstrated in the forests of the Ardennes in December of 1944. That modern war belonged to those who could master not just the tools of destruction, but the tools of coordination, that the invisible networks binding armies together were as important as the tanks and aircraft that dominated the battlefield. That command and control, properly conceived and executed, was itself a weapon of devastating effectiveness. German generals never imagined, but they learned, and the world learned with them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.